The cat no one wanted. There is a room at the back of every shelter that nobody talks about on the tours. At Millbrook Animal Shelter, ours was room 14. It sat at the far end of the east corridor, past the senior dog wing and the quarantine alcove, past the humming supply closet and the small whiteboard where volunteers wrote their names in red marker when they arrived. Most people never made it that far. The tours ended at the kitten nursery, where everything was soft and small and easy to fall in love with. The kitten nursery smelled like warm milk and cedar shavings, and it made people smile before they were fully through the door. The tours ended there because that was where we wanted them to end, because the east corridor required explanations we were not always ready to give. Room 14 was a different kind of room entirely. I had worked at Millbrook for 11 years by the time any of this happened. 11 years of intake paperwork and surrender interviews and midnight calls about animals found on highway shoulders. I had helped reunite a dog with a family who had been looking for him for 3 months. I had stayed past midnight coaxing a feral Tom out from inside the wall of the storage shed where he had wedged himself in a panic and would not move. I had driven my own car to an emergency vet at 2 in the morning with a litter of kittens wrapped in my jacket because the transport van was already out on another call. I had, over 11 years, come to understand what most people who work in animal welfare come to understand eventually, which is that this job is not really about animals. It is about learning to hold the full weight of something fragile without either dropping it or gripping so tight you crush it. It is a balance you practice every day and never fully master. I had seen cats come in feral and leave tame. I had seen dogs who terrified every trainer eventually offer their belly to a 6-year-old child. I had seen the version of this story that ends well, more times than most people would expect, and I had seen the version that doesn't, but I had never seen anything like Sable. The shelter smelled the way shelters do in early October, disinfectant underneath everything, and underneath the disinfectant, the particular animal warmth of dozens of small lives pressed close together. Pine shavings and wet fur and something metallic and faint that you stop noticing after your first week and only smell again when you come back from vacation. Outside, the maple at the edge of the parking lot had turned a deep arterial red. I noticed it every morning through the break room window while I made the first pot of coffee, the one I was always alone to drink. I liked the early morning shift for that reason. The quiet before the phones started. The moment before the weight of the day settled onto my shoulders and stayed there until I drove home. That morning I was training Dana, our newest adoption counselor, on the East Corridor rounds. She was 24, careful, the kind of person who crouched to be eye level with every animal she met and seemed to understand instinctively that this meant something to them, that being looked at from above and being looked at from beside were entirely different experiences, if you were small and uncertain. I could tell she was going to be good at this job within the first 20 minutes of training her, which meant I could also tell she was going to find it hard. We moved through the corridor methodically, checking water levels and food amounts, noting anything unusual in the log. Dana was fast, attentive, asking the right questions, the ones that showed she was thinking about the animals as individuals rather than as inventory. We reached the senior dog wing without incident, pausing to greet the 2 greyhounds who pressed their narrow faces against the kennel glass whenever anyone walked past, hopeful and patient in equal measure. We passed the quarantine alcove, which was empty that week. We passed the supply closet with its perpetual hum, the mop bucket that needed replacing, the stack of cardboard carriers we kept meaning to reorganize. At room 14, I stopped. I always stopped differently at room 14. My pace changed. My shoulders dropped slightly, or maybe rose, I was never sure. Some combination of caution and something older, harder to define. "What's in there?" Dana asked. I glanced through the small observation window set into the door. The room was dim, lit only by the natural light from a narrow window near the ceiling. In the far back corner, motionless against the cinder block wall, sat a cat. Coal black, every inch of her, with no markings and no variation in color, the kind of black that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. Medium build, lean, 7 years old according to her file. She was not sleeping. She was facing the door with the kind of focused, deliberate stillness that takes effort to hold. The kind of stillness that is not rest but vigilance. "That's Sable," I said. "She's been here 14 months. Dana leaned toward the window, her breath fogging the glass faintly. She looked scared. "She is. Can we go in?" "Not alone," I said. "Never alone," And never without telling someone first where you're going. I pulled her gently back from the door before she could ask why, and I gave her the standard briefing. 3 bite incidents documented in 14 months, all during handling procedures, all requiring wound care and a formal incident report. Each time, she had bitten without warning visible to the handler. The label in our system was unadoptable. The label meant she was not shown to prospective adopters. She did not appear on our website or our social media. She did not get walked to the viewing room on adoption days when families came through with their children and their excitement and their good intentions. She lived in room 14, and room 14 had quietly become the kind of place staff avoided mentioning to visitors unless pressed, and the kind of place that appeared in budget conversations as a line item nobody wanted to read out loud. Dana listened to all of this with her arms folded and her eyes very steady. Then she asked the question nobody had asked in over a year. Not because it wasn't obvious. It was always obvious. But we had all, without any meeting or discussion, agreed by gradual mutual consent to stop asking it, because the asking of it led somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere that required you to feel things you were often too tired to feel. What happened to her before she got here? I looked through the observation window one more time. Sable had not moved. She was still watching the door. "I'll pull the file," I said. I had not opened Sable's intake file in over a year. This is not the kind of thing I am proud of. I had opened it twice in her first month at Millbrook, read through the intake notes and the behavioral history, then filed it in the cabinet behind my desk, where I keep the long-stay records, tucked behind the tab dividers where things go when there is no immediate action to take, and the looking at them only costs you something you cannot afford at that moment. After that, I had told myself I was too busy to revisit it, which was true in the way that most useful lies are true. I was busy. I am always busy at Millbrook. The intake list is never short, and the staff is never quite large enough, and every day brings a new version of an emergency. But that wasn't why I didn't open it. I knew that. I just didn't say it. I opened the file the night after Dana's question, at my kitchen table, with a mug of coffee going cold beside me, and the October wind pushing leaves against the window in small, dry bursts. My apartment is quiet in a way that took getting used to after my mother died. She had lived 3 blocks from Millbrook for 30 years, and in the last 2 years of her life I was over there 3 or 4 times a week, for Sunday dinners and doctor's appointments, and the kind of company that doesn't require a reason. After she died, the quiet in my apartment acquired a texture it hadn't had before, a presence in the shape of an absence. I spread the file on the table and I read it from the beginning. Her surrendering owner's name was Carol Whitmore, 71 years old at time of surrender. The address on the form was a house on Birchwood Lane, the older part of town with the wide covered porches and the big elm trees that arch over the street in summer and make it feel like a tunnel of green. I knew those streets from driving my mother to her cardiologist, whose office was 2 blocks from the corner of Birchwood and Maple. I could picture the houses without effort. Carol Whitmore had surrendered Sable on a Tuesday morning in August, 14 months ago. The intake worker's notes described her as visibly distressed, took additional time. In the notes section, written in Carol's own handwriting because she had asked to fill out the form herself rather than have someone do it for her, it said, "Sable is very loving. She just needs time to adjust. She has never lived anywhere but with me. Please be patient with her. She is not mean. She is only scared." Below that, in a different pen, a different handwriting, the intake worker had added a single line. "Owner is terminally ill. Family is handling relocation. Owner insisted on completing paperwork personally. Carol Whitmore died in hospice care 3 weeks after surrendering Sable." I sat with that fact for a long time at the kitchen table. Sable had been 7 years old when she was surrendered, which meant Carol had gotten her as a kitten, or close to it. 7 years of the same house, the same smells, the same hands, the same voice saying her name. 7 years of knowing one person's schedule so precisely that she would have known the sound of that car in the driveway, the particular way that one set of footsteps came down the hall, the smell of that specific person at the end of a specific day. Cats do not experience time the way humans experience time, but they experience presence and absence with a specificity and a depth that most people underestimate. 7 years with one person is not a habit, it is a world. And then one Tuesday in August, that world ended, not gradually, not with any transition she could have understood. One day Carol came home and the next day she was gone. and instead there were strangers and a carrier, and fluorescent lights, and the smell of disinfectant over animal fear, and a small room with cinder-block walls, where nothing smelled like anything she had ever known. I thought about the bite incidents in a different way after reading this. Each one occurred during a handling procedure, a veterinary check, a routine cleaning, a health inspection. Each time, a stranger had reached for her, and she had responded the only way she had left. Not aggression in any meaningful sense of the word. Terror. The kind of terror that has no language and no recourse except the body. The file had one more item. I had noticed the small Ziploc bag clipped to the back cover the first time I read the file, 14 months ago, and I had not looked at it closely then. I had not wanted to. I unclipped it from the cover and held it up to the kitchen light. Inside the bag, carefully coiled, was a collar. Narrow, fabric, a faded cornflower blue, soft with washing, the nap worn thin at the points of most contact. From one of the loops hung a small silver charm, shaped like a fish, the kind you find in craft stores or pet boutiques, simple and small, and exactly the kind of thing a woman living alone would have chosen for her cat. The paint on the fish was worn to a dull, bare shine at the highest point of the arc, where it had been touched the most. Carol Whitmore had removed that collar from her cat before saying goodbye. She had put it in a plastic bag and attached it to the intake file because she wanted Sable to have it wherever she ended up, or because she could not stand to take it home with her, or both. Both things can be true. That collar had been sitting in my filing cabinet for 14 months. I set it on the kitchen table beside the coffee mug, and I looked at it for a while. I understood, reading that file, why Sable bit people. I understood the terror behind the motionless corner pressing, and the refusing to eat until the room emptied, and the way she watched the door without ever fully sleeping. I had studied animal behavior for years, and none of that knowledge was what made me understand it. What made me understand it was simpler and more personal than that. I had watched grief make my own body rigid. I had watched it make me hypervigilant, braced for the next loss, unable to fully trust that anything was safe, because the thing I had been most certain was permanent had turned out not to be. Grief had made me smaller and quieter and faster to flinch, and I was a person with language and therapy and friends who checked on me. Sable had none of that. She had a cinder-block room and a Ziploc bag in a filing cabinet, and strangers who reached for her without knowing what reaching for her cost. I took the file home that night. I had never done that before. I stood at my car in the empty parking lot for a moment, holding the folder, looking back at the building. The maple was dark in the parking lot lights, its red almost black in that light, the leaves trembling in the cold wind coming off the hills. I got in and drove home and did not sleep much. 6 days later, on a Saturday morning, I arrived at the shelter an hour before the first volunteer shift. The parking lot was empty. The maple was losing its leaves now, the red scattered across the asphalt in wet, pressed shapes like hands. A cold front had come through overnight, and the air had that sharpened quality of early November pretending to be October. I let myself in through the staff entrance, walked past the break room without stopping, and went straight to the east corridor. I stood outside, room 14, for 20 minutes before I opened the door. This is not an exaggeration. I stood there in the corridor with the fluorescent light buzzing faintly above me, and I waited. I am not fully sure what I was waiting for. Permission, maybe, or a settling of my own nerves into something quiet enough to be useful. I had worked with difficult animals before. I had spent weeks building trust with dogs who arrived from neglect situations, months with a feral cat colony. We were gradually socializing. I knew the protocols. I knew the theory. None of that knowledge felt relevant at that moment. This felt different, in the way that things sometimes feel different when they have become personal without your permission. I want to be clear about what I brought in with me. No food, because food can create pressure, a transactional dynamic that isn't trust. No toys, for similar reasons. No gloves. I wore old jeans and a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it was soft all the way through. In my bag, I had a worn paperback, a novel I had been reading slowly for weeks, about a lighthouse keeper on a remote island who realizes one winter that he has stopped being able to make himself leave, even when the supply boats come and the opportunity is there. I'm not sure why I chose that particular book to bring. It was what I had. It felt right in some way. I didn't analyze at the time. I unlocked the door and sat down on the floor just inside the threshold, leaving the door open behind me. The room was cool, maybe 65 degrees, lit by the narrow window near the ceiling where gray morning light came in at a low angle. Sable's sleeping platform was against the right wall, her food and water on a raised stand beside it. She was in the back left corner. She had her body pressed flat against the junction of the two walls, her ears pinned, every muscle locked. The moment I sat down, she went completely rigid, then still. The particular stillness of a prey animal that has decided that not moving is the safest available option. I did not speak to her. I did not look at her directly. I opened the book, and I began reading to myself, silently, tracking the words without fully taking them in. The lighthouse keeper was in his third winter on the island by that point in the story. His supply of oil was running low. He knew it, and kept not telling anyone. After a few minutes, I let my eyes drift toward her without turning my head, the way you watch something at the periphery, taking it in without announcing that you're looking. She was still in the corner, still watching me. Her amber eyes were the only warm color in the room. She did not growl, she did not hiss, she did not approach, and she did not retreat. She held her position, and she watched me the way an animal watches something it has not yet classified as safe or dangerous, gathering information, running the calculation. Time passed in the particular way it passes, in very quiet rooms, slowly, then in jumps. I turned pages without reading them. At the 30-minute mark, something changed in her posture. A small change, the kind you would miss if you were not paying close attention. She had stopped pressing against the wall. Her body was upright now, not flattened. The muscles in her back and shoulders had shifted from compressed to simply still. She was still in the corner, but she was sitting in it rather than wedging herself into it. At the 40-minute mark, she turned to face me directly, full on, her body squared toward the door, toward where I was sitting, not threatening, not coiled, not preparing to spring or retreat, just oriented, looking. I looked back. I let my eyes go soft and unfocused, the way you do to signal you are not a threat. In the language that cats read with a fluency most people never learn to speak. I kept my body completely still. I kept my hands visible and open on my knees. For about 30 seconds, we existed in the same room without either of us wanting anything specific from the other. Then I closed the book, rose very slowly, and left. In the hallway, I pulled the door shut behind me and pressed my back against the wall. The corridor hummed around me. From somewhere in the building, a dog was barking, short and rhythmic, the alert bark rather than the distress bark. The supply closet clicked and droned. The break room smelled of the previous day's coffee. My hands were shaking, not from fear. I want to be clear about that. From something else, something that lives close to awe and close to grief, and is sometimes hard to tell from either. The particular tremor that comes when something you had stopped believing in becomes briefly, unexpectedly real. I had been in that room for 40 minutes, and Sable had not attacked me, had not fled to the far corner and refused to move, had not screamed or yowled or bitten. She had watched me, and then she had turned to face me, which in the language we were speaking was not a small thing at all. I came back the next morning, and the morning after that. 14 Saturdays, sometimes Sundays too, and early weekday mornings when my schedule bent enough to allow it. I kept a log in a small spiral notebook, documenting what changed and what didn't, tracking the distances and the silences in whatever unit of measurement applied. I did not share this log with the rest of the staff, not because I was hiding anything, but because I wasn't sure yet what I was documenting, and because some things need quiet to grow, and because what was happening in that room felt too provisional, too new, too fragile to withstand the weight of other people's expectations. I brought the paper back every time. It became the thing that marked the beginning of each session, the way a ritual marks the beginning of something, the opening of the book, the settling onto the floor, the first page. I had stopped reading for content. The words themselves didn't matter. It was the sound of the pages turning, the rhythm of someone sitting quietly with words, the signal that I was not there to do anything to her, only to be there, which is a different category of presence entirely. The changes came slowly, and they came in a specific order that I came to understand only in retrospect, looking back over the notebook entries from the early weeks when I could not yet see the shape they were making. In the second week, she began moving to the center of the room within about 15 minutes of my arriving. Not close, not toward me, just out of the corner, into the middle of her own space, as though she had decided the corner was no longer the safest position available, as though some minimal recalculation had occurred. In the 4th week, she began eating while I was present. This sounds small. It was not small. Cats in chronic stress routinely refuse food in the presence of perceived threats, because eating requires looking down, which requires vulnerability, which requires a level of safety the body won't authorize when it's on alert. The fact that she would eat with me in the room meant that my presence had been reclassified somewhere in the machinery of her nervous system. Not safe, not yet, but no longer actively threatening. The distinction mattered enormously. I watched her eat from across the room, pretending to read. She would lift her eyes to me between bites, checking. I would look away, down at the book, and when I looked back, she would have returned to the bowl. In the 6th week, I started reading aloud, quietly, not directed at her, just into the air of the room, the way you might read aloud to yourself when you're alone. The lighthouse keeper had made a decision by that point in the novel, a quiet and significant one, though he hadn't told anyone yet. Sable's ears moved when I began speaking, oriented toward my voice, tracking. She did not retreat. She shifted in place, the way a cat shifts when it is listening carefully, and she stayed where she was. I came every morning that week. In the 8th week, she sat 3 feet from me. She had been slowly, incrementally, closing the distance over the preceding weeks in the way that only becomes visible when you are not watching for it. Each session she ended up slightly closer than the one before, moved not all at once but in a series of small adjustments that individually looked like nothing. Then one morning I looked up from the book and she was 3 feet away, sitting upright, her tail curled around her paws, looking at me with the amber eyes that had been watching me from the far corner of this room for 2 months. I did not reach for her. I kept reading. I did not change the volume or the pace of my voice. Inside, in the part of myself that I was keeping very quiet in that room, I felt something move in my chest so sharply and so unexpectedly that I had to breathe through it, steadily, so that my hands didn't shake. She was still there when I closed the book that morning, 3 feet away, not touching, not fully trusting, not by any measure whole, but present, choosing to be there, which is different from simply not leaving. Roz noticed. Roz had been at Millbrook for longer than I had, a veterinary technician who had come up through 3 different shelter systems and had arrived at Millbrook 8 years ago with the kind of competence that doesn't advertise itself and doesn't need to. She kept her opinions in reserve until they mattered, and when she delivered them, she was usually right. She cornered me in the break room on a Thursday afternoon in late November, poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether I wanted one, and sat across from me with the unhurried manner of someone who has chosen her moment with care. "You know she can't go home with you," Roz said. It was not really about whether I could take Sable home. I rented an apartment where pets were technically allowed, but where I had always reasoned that the instability of shelter work made pet ownership complicated for me, an argument I had been making to myself for years and that I suspected was not entirely honest. What Roz was asking was something larger. "What are you doing in there? What do you think this leads to? What happens to you if it leads nowhere?" "I know," I said. She held her coffee with both hands, the way she always did. 14 months is a long time for that animal, Jamie. It's a long time for you, too. And, Aret. "I know." She looked at me across the small table. The break room had a motivational poster on the wall that someone had put up years ago and that we had all stopped seeing. Behind Roz, the coffee maker hissed as it cooled. "Your mom used to do this," she said. "The ones nobody wanted." I did not answer her. I finished my coffee and went back to work and did not think about it again until much later, when I was driving home and the maple was bare and black against a sky the color of pewter, and the thought caught me off guard, the way true things sometimes do when you've been successfully avoiding them. My mother had volunteered at a cat rescue for the last 12 years of her life. She had a talent for the difficult ones, the ones who arrived spitting and half feral, the ones who bit the other volunteers. She would sit with them in the recovery room for hours, reading or just being there, unhurried and steady, and she would come home with scratches on her forearms that she called thank you notes. She died with 7 cats in her house, every one of them a different version of the same story. I had thought of this, briefly, when I first started sitting with Sable, and then I had put it away because I was not ready for what it meant. The following Wednesday, The system flagged Sable for euthanasia review. I had known this was coming. I had known it the way you know about certain weather systems, with a certainty that doesn't make the arrival any easier. Every animal in a shelter beyond a certain length of stay gets flagged when the resource math stops working, and the math had stopped working for Sable months ago. The review board met on the second Friday of each month to make decisions about long-stay animals, and those decisions were not made lightly by anyone on the board, but they were made because they had to be, because the alternative was a shelter that ran out of room for any new animal, and then helped no one at all. Euthanasia, for behavioral designation, is distinct from medical euthanasia. It is not the word anyone in this field says casually, but it exists, and it accounts for a real and significant portion of shelter deaths in underfunded facilities, and Sable had been labeled behaviorally unadoptable for 14 months, which meant the Friday review was not a formality. The review was set for a Friday. This was a Wednesday. I went to room 14 that afternoon and I sat on the floor and I opened the book and I read aloud for 3 hours. The lighthouse keeper had finally made his choice by this point. The supply boat had come and he had walked to the dock and he had looked at the sea and he had decided to stay, not because he was afraid to leave, but because he had understood something about the island that he hadn't understood at the beginning. Sable sat 6 inches from my knee for most of the afternoon, closer than she had ever been. Her eyes half closed, her breathing slow and even. I talked to the director Thursday morning. Her name was Margaret, and she had been running Millbrook for 6 years, with the practical-minded compassion of someone who understood both what animals needed and what a shelter could sustain. I told her everything. She listened with her hands folded on her desk, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She agreed to one condition. If an adoption application was filed within 30 days, the review would be suspended, not indefinitely. 30 days. The window was specific and bounded because it had to be. I went back to my desk, and I updated Sable's profile on our website for the first time since her intake photograph was taken 14 months earlier. I removed the behavioral history language. I uploaded a photograph that I had taken through the observation window the previous week, which showed her sitting in the center of the room, her amber eyes calm and direct and fully visible, her posture composed rather than compressed. I wrote a description that took me 4 drafts to get right. The final version said, Sable is a 7-year-old domestic shorthair who came to us after the loss of her lifelong owner. She has taken a long time to feel safe here. For the right person, with the right patience, she will be worth every minute of it. I pressed post without rereading it, and went to check on the evening feeding rounds. The application arrived the following afternoon at 4:17 p.m. I almost missed it in the day's volume. We received dozens of adoption applications weekly, and I had been in back-to-back intake interviews through most of the morning and afternoon, a pair of surrenders from an apartment complex where the no-pet policy had been suddenly enforced. Both cats, elderly, both terrified, both going into temporary boarding while we scrambled to find fosters. By the time I sat down at my desk, the afternoon light was already going low and orange through the window, and my coffee from 3 hours ago was cold beside the keyboard. The notification appeared in my inbox between a supply order confirmation and a volunteer scheduling request. I opened it out of the reflexive habit of processing applications as they arrived, expecting another young family wanting a sociable lap cat, already composing the gentle redirection in my head. The applicant's name was Thomas Okafor, 68 years old, retired civil engineer. He lived on the east side of town, near the botanical garden, in a house he described in the application as having good windows and quiet rooms. He wrote in complete sentences, with no abbreviations and no informal shorthand, the writing of someone who had spent a career producing careful documents and saw no reason to change register for an adoption application. He wrote that he had owned cats for most of his adult life, that his and his wife's last cat together, a tortoiseshell named Francis, had died 4 months after his wife passed from pancreatic cancer in February. He had waited, he wrote, because he wanted to be sure he was making this choice for the right reasons, and not just because the house was too quiet. He believed he was now sure. He wrote, I am not in a hurry. I have time. I read that line 3 times in a row. Then I read the whole application again from the beginning, slowly. The way you read something when you want to be certain you are not seeing what you want to see, rather than what is there. I sat back in my chair and looked through the window at the maple, which by now was entirely bare, its branches dark and clean against the pale sky. and I felt something that arrived before understanding did. Something that is not logic but precedes it. The kind of recognition that moves through you before your mind has caught up with it. 8 words. I am not in a hurry. I have time. Simple. Ordinary in their construction. But in the context of a 7-year-old black cat who had spent 14 months in a room at the back of a shelter that nobody mentioned on tours, those 8 words were the opposite of ordinary. I called Thomas Okafor that same afternoon. He answered on the second ring. His voice was measured and warm, quiet in a way that suggested it was always quiet, not subdued by circumstance but naturally pitched to a lower register, the voice of someone who had learned to listen before speaking. I introduced myself and told him I was calling about his application for Sable. Then I told him everything. All of it. The 14 months. The behavioral record. The bite incidents and what they meant and what they came from. The grief history. Carol Whitmore. The Ziploc bag with the collar. The euthanasia review. And the 30-day window. I did not frame any of it gently. He deserved to know exactly what he was applying for, and I had neither the time nor the temperament to be anything less than direct. He listened all the way through without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. A real pause. Not the pause of someone gathering a polite response, but the pause of someone actually sitting with what they had just heard. "When can I come?" he said. I exhaled. "How is next Tuesday?" "Tuesday is fine," he said. "I'll be there." Thomas arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after I posted Sable's profile. He drove a dark blue sedan, older model, well-maintained, the car of someone who takes care of things they own. He wore a gray wool coat with the collar turned up against the November wind, unhurried, his pace carrying the deliberate quality of a man who has decided at some point that speed is not always the virtue it presents itself as. I watched him cross the parking lot from the lobby window before going out to meet him. He moved carefully on the frost-slicked pavement, one hand briefly touching the car's side mirror for balance, then straightening. I had been running intake interviews for 11 years. I could usually tell within the first few minutes what kind of adopter someone was going to be. Not in terms of whether they were good people. Most of the people who came through our doors were good people, but in terms of their relationship to the idea of an animal. There were people who wanted comfort and people who wanted companionship and people who wanted something to take care of and people who wanted to be healed. And the latter was the category I was most careful about, because it asked things of the animal that the animal could not always give. Thomas Okafor did not feel like any of those categories. He felt like something quieter, a person who had loved something and lost it, and was willing to begin again, with no guarantee of how it would go. We sat across from each other at the intake table, and I walked him through Sable's history a second time, all of it, because I needed to say it again while watching his face. He listened with the same attention he had given me on the phone, his large hands resting on the table in front of him, his eyes level and steady. He did not perform sympathy or reassurance. He simply absorbed the information. "She may never let you touch her," I said. "That's a real possibility you need to be prepared to live with." "I understand," he said. "She might take weeks or months to come out of the room you put her in when you first bring her home. Weeks before she'll eat in the same room as you." "I know," he said. "Frances was difficult at the start. My wife's cat from before we married. She decided on her own schedule. This is different from that," I said. "I know it is." His hands moved slightly on the table, not fidgeting, just settling. "But the principle is the same, isn't it? You wait. You don't push. You let them decide." I looked at him across the table for a moment. "Have you ever sat with an animal who didn't want to be approached?" I asked. "Really sat, for a long time, without expecting anything to happen." He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "After my wife died," he said, "Frances stopped eating for about a week. She would sit in my wife's chair, and I would sit in mine, sometimes for hours. I didn't approach her. I just kept being in the same room. Eventually she came to me." He paused. "I think we were doing the same thing for each other." I stood up. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." I prepped him again at the door to room 14, quietly, specifically. "Sit on the floor. Keep your body turned slightly sideways. Don't reach. Don't make sounds she hasn't heard yet. If she comes to you, let her lead." He listened without questions, which told me he had been thinking about this since Tuesday. I unlocked the door, and we went in. Sable was sitting in the center of the room, not the corner, the center. where she had been positioning herself with increasing consistency over the past several weeks. When the door opened and two people came through instead of one, she moved, not to the corner, but back, away from the door, toward the wall, re-establishing the distance she needed. Her eyes moved from Thomas to me and back to Thomas, quick and careful. I sat against the left wall, settling back, making myself small. Thomas sat down on the floor about 6 feet from the door without being told to, and the way he did it was the thing I noticed first. No performance of gentleness, no exaggerated slowness meant to signal harmlessness. He simply sat down, the way a person sits when they are genuinely comfortable sitting, his back against the wall, his legs extended, his large hands resting open and upturned on his knees. He did not look at Sable. He looked at the middle distance, at the wall in front of him. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a small photograph, roughly wallet-sized, worn at the corners. He looked at it for a moment, his face very quiet. Then he set it on the floor in front of him, face up, and left it there. I could not see the image from where I was sitting. I did not ask about it. I watched Sable. She watched Thomas. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building a door opened and closed. One of the dogs in the senior wing made a single soft sound and went still again. The light from the narrow ceiling window moved incrementally as the cloud cover shifted outside. 8 minutes passed. I counted them the way you count things you need to track but cannot actively track. In the background, marked but not measured. 8 minutes of 2 people and 1 cat existing in the same room without anything being asked of anyone. And then, Sable moved. She did not approach cautiously. She did not creep forward in the low, belly toward the floor posture of an uncertain animal testing unknown territory. She walked. 8 steps, even and unhurried, with her tail low but not tucked, her head at a neutral height, her eyes on Thomas. She crossed the room in a straight line, which meant she had decided before she moved. She arrived beside Thomas's left knee and she sat. She did not look up at him. She did not sniff his coat or investigate his hands. She simply sat, her body 3 or 4 inches from his knee, close enough that the warmth between them would have been mutual, and she looked at the photograph on the floor in front of her. Thomas's hands remained on his knees, completely still. He did not look down at her. He did not speak. He continued looking at the photograph with the same quiet expression he had come in wearing, and his breathing was slow and even, and nothing about him changed in any visible way except that, after a moment, the faintest shift moved across his features. Not surprise, not triumph, something more like recognition. Something more like finally. I had moved to the observation window without registering that I had moved. Both of my palms were pressed flat against the glass. Sable adjusted her position slightly, settling her weight, and she was no longer quite 3 inches from Thomas's knee. She was closer, perhaps an inch, perhaps less, not touching, not quite. But she had made the choice to reduce the distance, and in the only language that mattered in that room, the choice was everything. Thomas sat with her. That was all. He sat with her the way she had been sat with for 14 Saturdays, without agenda, without pressure, without asking for anything she hadn't already decided to give. I made myself step back from the window. I made myself walk down the east corridor to the break room, where I sat down in the chair by the door, the one with the wobbly leg that Roz had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and I cried. Not the careful kind, the small and manageable kind that stays behind your eyes and requires only a moment. The full kind, the kind that arrives when something you had been quietly not expecting finds a way in past all the places where you had been keeping it out. I had not cried like that since the night my mother died, 2 years ago, on a Tuesday in November. The coincidence of the day landed on me suddenly and I let it, because I was alone, and the room was empty, and some grief is better off moving when it finally finds the door. Roz found me there 10 minutes later. She came in and looked at me and then sat down in the other chair and did not say anything for a while, which was the right thing to do and which she knew was the right thing to do, which is something not everyone knows. She went to him, I said, when I could. Roz reached over and patted my arm once, her hand heavy and warm and brief. Of course she did, she said. The rest of the staff learned about it in pieces, which is the way news travels in a small building where everyone is always slightly too busy for a real conversation, but not too busy to notice when something shifts in the air. Dana was the first. She stopped me in the corridor the following morning, already partway through a question about the new intake forms, and then paused when she saw my face. "Something happened with Sable," she said. "It was not a question," I told her. She stood very still while I spoke, her clipboard held against her chest, her eyes getting steadily wider until I reached the part about Sable walking across the room. 8 minutes, she said. 8 minutes. 8. She shook her head slowly. Then she kept walking. But she was smiling in a way I don't think she was fully aware of. The kind of smile that comes from the outside, rather than from the decision to smile. Margaret, the director, asked me the next day if I would write something for the staff log about what had changed in Sable's handling protocol, a document she planned to share with the regional shelter network as a case study. I started writing it twice and deleted it both times. There are experiences in this work that belong to the work and can be documented and systematized, and there are experiences that belong to something else, something less transmissible. Sitting in a quiet room with an animal that has decided to stop being afraid is both of those things, and mostly the second one. I told Margaret I would write a summary of the behavioral observations and leave the rest of it out. Roz went to room 14 herself that afternoon, just to look through the observation window. She came back and told me that Sable was sitting in the center of the room, grooming her front paw with the leisurely focus of an animal that has, at this particular moment, no concerns. "First time I've seen that," Roz said. "Me too," I said. I went to my filing cabinet and took out Sable's intake file. I turned to the page in the system where her designation was listed, printed in the standard shelter coding language that most visitors to the website never see, and that most of us try not to look at directly when it refers to an animal we know. I updated the designation, printed the new entry, and replaced the old page with the new one. The word unadoptable had been on that page for 14 months. I did not throw the old page away. I folded it and put it in the back of the file, behind the intake notes, a record of a category that had been wrong about her from the beginning. Then I went to the supply closet where I had put the Ziploc bag after bringing it in from home, and I carried it down the corridor to the lobby where Thomas Okafor was waiting in one of the chairs, his wool coat folded over his lap, the adoption paperwork spread neatly on the low table beside him. I set the bag down on the table in front of him without explanation. He looked at it. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, looking at the blue collar and the silver fish charm through the clear plastic. His face was very still and very quiet for a long time. I watched him absorb what he was looking at and what it meant, and I let the silence hold. Then he slipped the bag into the chest pocket of his coat, close against the same pocket where he kept the photograph. He did not explain the photograph. I did not ask. "Some things close themselves around their meanings and they are not yours to open," Thomas asked, before leaving whether he could come back one more day before taking Sable home. He wanted to bring the carrier and let her be around it before the day she actually had to go into it. He said it without apology or over-explanation. I wanted to go smoothly for her sake, not mine. "Come Thursday," I said. Thursday morning was the kind of November morning that doesn't commit to anything. Not cold enough for frost, not warm enough to be comfortable. The light came in pale and uncommitted through the east windows, and the maple in the parking lot was stripped entirely bare now, its branches dark and clean, reaching upward in the way bare branches do in late autumn, as though the tree were showing you something it had been concealing all year. The shelter was quieter than usual that morning. The morning shift had come in, and the feeding rounds were underway, and the usual controlled busyness of the early hours was moving through the building. But something in the quality of the air felt different. Or maybe I was the thing that felt different, and I was giving the air credit for it. Thomas arrived at 8:30 with the soft-sided carrier, dark blue fabric, the zipper running cleanly around the top. He had lined it with a folded fleece blanket in a deep burgundy color, already faintly scented with his home. He set it carefully on the floor of the lobby and signed the last of the paperwork, working through each page methodically, asking one specific question about the veterinary transfer protocol, and nodding once when I answered it. He folded his copy of the adoption contract and placed it in the breast pocket of his coat, alongside the Ziploc bag. We walked down the east corridor together without speaking. I was aware of the corridor's sounds the way you are aware of familiar things on a last morning. The supply closet hum, the soft percussion of dogs shifting in the senior wing, the fluorescent lights, the volunteer sign-in board with its cluster of names in red marker. At room 14, Thomas stopped and looked through the observation window for a moment before going in. Sable was in the center of the room, sitting upright, her amber eyes directed toward the door. As though she had heard us coming, we went in. Thomas set the carrier on the floor with its door open, and then sat down beside it, not moving, not making any sound directed toward her, not doing anything at all, except being there. I settled against the wall. What followed was 20 minutes of the most patient thing I have ever watched a person do. Sable looked at the carrier. Then she looked at Thomas. Then back at the carrier. She approached it once and stopped 2 feet away and sat. She groomed her left shoulder carefully and deliberately, which is a displacement behavior, a way of giving the body something to do when the mind is uncertain. She circled the carrier at a distance of about 4 feet, counterclockwise, her nose working. She sat again. She looked at Thomas. Thomas did not move. He did not lean toward her or make encouraging sounds or shift his posture to suggest patience. He simply held his position with the ease of someone who has genuinely decided that the outcome is not up to him, that his job in this moment is only to be present and let everything else find its own shape. She went to the carrier opening on her own. She put her nose inside, pulled back, stood for a moment, then stepped in. She turned around inside the carrier, once, the tight, careful turn of an animal checking its own situation, and then she settled. She did not look comfortable. She did not look happy. She looked like an animal that has made a decision, which is different from looking resigned. She had made the choice herself, which was everything. Thomas reached forward and fastened the carrier door with one slow, continuous motion. He lifted it gently with both hands, one beneath and one steadying the top, and he stood. I opened the door and we walked out together, down the east corridor, past the supply closet, past the whiteboard with its red names, past the senior dog wing, where both greyhounds pressed their long, narrow noses to the glass to watch us go, their breath clouding the panels. Halfway down the corridor, in the stretch where the morning light from the far window reached farthest, I heard it. It came without warning and without any precedent that I could point to in 14 months of documentation. I had never heard this sound from Sable, not once, not in a single session across all those Saturdays, not in the brief and fraught handling procedures that had resulted in bite incidents, not in the quiet hours I had sat reading while she watched me from 3 feet away. It was a purr. Faint at first, and rough, the way something sounds when it is remembering how to work after a long time in disuse. The mechanism of it, the whole physical machinery of comfort and safety, warming up from cold, but continuous, steady, traveling the length of the corridor in the soft carrier, coming through the mesh panel at the front, filling the space around us. I stopped walking. Thomas stopped too. He looked down at the carrier and then at me. I did not say anything. I do not think there was anything to say. Roz was standing at the far end of the corridor. She had come out of the intake room, and she was holding a clipboard, but she had gone very still. Her head was tilted slightly, the way it does when she is listening hard. Her eyes moved from the carrier to my face. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. In the lobby, Dana was at the desk. She looked up when we came through the door, and then she was on her feet without having decided to stand, her hand going to her mouth when she heard what was coming from the carrier. She caught herself and sat back down, but when I passed her, she touched my arm briefly, very lightly, without saying anything. Thomas thanked me at the lobby doors. He shook my hand with the careful warmth of someone who means it. He said he would be in touch, and I believed him. And then he walked across the frost-silvered parking lot to the dark blue sedan and settled the carrier carefully on the back seat and buckled it in and drove out of the lot without hurrying. I stood at the lobby window. The purr had stopped when he put the carrier in the car, or perhaps it hadn't stopped, and I simply couldn't hear it anymore through the glass and the distance and the engine noise. I stood there for a while after the car turned out of sight, and the bare maple made its thin geometry against the gray November sky, and inside me, something settled that had been unsettled for a very long time. I chose to believe the purr had not stopped. 3 months later, in the second week of February, a letter arrived at Millbrook addressed to me by name. The envelope was cream-colored and heavier than standard, the address written in Thomas Okafor's careful, deliberate hand. I knew it was his before I opened it. Recognized the handwriting from the adoption application, from the contract he had signed in the lobby. I opened it at my desk on a Friday morning before the phone started, with the first coffee of the day warming my hands. He wrote that Sable had spent the first 4 days under the bed in the back bedroom. He had set her food and water near the bed rather than in the kitchen, so she did not have to move far to eat. He sat on the floor beside the bed each morning and each evening, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting quietly, and he did not try to coax her out or check on her in ways that would have required her to acknowledge him. On the 5th day, she had come out on her own at some point during the night and walked through the house, which he knew because he found her sitting at the window in the kitchen the following morning, watching the backyard. She had gone back under the bed when he entered the room, but she had come out. She now slept at the foot of his bed. She sat in the window in the afternoons, in the room that faced the backyard where the light was best in winter. She had, he wrote, a habit of appearing wherever he was reading, not asking for anything, not sitting on his book or demanding attention, simply arranging herself nearby and staying. He found this, he wrote, deeply companionable. He wrote, "She is not afraid anymore, or if she is afraid in the small, manageable way that allows for living. I think I understand something about that kind of fear. Warning." He included a photograph, printed on standard photo paper, a recent one by the color and quality of the light. In the photograph, Sable was sitting in a wide window, with winter light pouring through the glass onto her black coat, turning it to something warmer, something that moved between black and dark brown in the places where the light caught it. She was looking outward, toward the backyard, her posture composed and unhurried. In the background of the photograph, out of focus but visible, was a framed picture on the wall, too small and blurred to see clearly. On the windowsill beside her was a small plant in a terracotta pot. Around her neck was the blue collar. The silver fish charm caught the light at the highest point of its arc, the same dull, bright shine it had carried in the Ziploc bag in my filing cabinet for 14 months. Thomas had taken it out of the bag and put it back where it belonged. I stood at my desk looking at that photograph for a long time. Then I took it to the small corkboard above my desk, between the intake calendar and the evacuation route map, and I pinned it there with a blue pushpin, where I would see it every time I sat down, where I would see it on the days the phones didn't stop, and the cages were full, and the budget numbers were wrong, and the beautiful, difficult math of this work was making demands I wasn't sure I could meet, where I would see it and remember what the math was for. The worn paperback is still in room 14. I left it there on purpose, tucked on the shelf above the sleeping platform, because room 14 is never empty for long. There is a 3-year-old tabby named Gordon in there now, arrived from a hoarding case 2 months ago, still working out whether the world intends to hurt him or not. He sits in the corner and watches the door. We are being patient with Gordon. I go in on Saturday mornings and sit on the floor and read aloud and do not ask for anything. We have time. Not unlimited time, but enough. There is something I have been thinking about since February, since the photograph arrived, since I stood in the east corridor and heard a sound come out of a cat who had not made that sound in over a year. I have been thinking about what the word unadoptable actually means, and what it does not mean, and why the distinction matters as much as it does. The word implies a fixed truth. It implies a quality that lives inside the animal, permanent and structural, some essential deficit that places the animal outside the possibility of belonging anywhere. We use the word when we are frightened, or overwhelmed, or out of ideas, and I understand why we use it, because sometimes there are no good options, and the word does a kind of necessary work in the terrible arithmetic of shelter management. But the word is also, in its most fundamental application, simply wrong. It is a description of a relationship that hasn't been found yet, not a description of an animal's nature. Sable was not unadoptable. She was grieving. She was a 7-year-old animal who had spent her whole life loved by one person and who had been placed without context or explanation into a cinder-block room in an unfamiliar building, surrounded by unfamiliar smells and sounds, with no language for what had happened, and no way to understand that the person who had been her whole world for 7 years was not coming back. She responded to that situation the only way available to her, with the full force of her fear, and we labeled the fear as a personality trait, and filed her in the back of the building and called her unadoptable. She was not unadoptable. She was waiting for someone who knew what waiting felt like. Those two things are not the same. They were never the same. And the distance between them, the distance between a label and a truth, the distance between a Ziploc bag and a filing cabinet and a blue collar in a February window, is exactly the distance that this work asks us to hold open. Every day, with everything we have. If Sable's story found its way to something you carry, let me know in the comments with a simple one. If you have ever loved an animal that took a long time to trust, leave a 0. Your comments reach more people than you might realize, and every one of them helps these stories find the people who need them. If you want to follow the next rescue, the next long-stay animal, the next quiet miracle at the end of a corridor nobody mentions on tours, subscribe. We have more stories coming. Some of them will be hard. Some of them will be the other thing. I hope you'll be here for all of them.